Thanks so much for coming to this talk today. We titled it Are Jewish Americans Becoming Republican? And if you're here just to hear the answer, then it's no, and you have time for another session. But I still think it's worthwhile spending a few minutes of your time discussing where Jewish voters stand right now, why both sides seem to believe that Jewish voters are flocking or trending towards their side, and what it means in the upcoming elections. We're entering an election cycle. Most of you were busy in sessions last night while the Republicans were debating. I'm sure you didn't see the debate. It was actually a good one if you get to catch up on that later on. And in both parties will try to look at the Jewish vote in the upcoming elections to see how they can get more Jewish voters to their side. But it's also a moral issue, and it has some significance for both sides. Republicans really believe that they're trending very slowly, but they're trending towards greater success with the Jewish voters, and they'd like to see this momentum they believe they have carry over to the 2016 elections. Democrats saw a little drop in Jewish vote, and we'll see the numbers soon in 2012, and they would like to correct course. That's why Jewish voters can expect to get a lot of attention in these upcoming elections. Of course, if most of you are from New York, you're not going to get much attention, but that's how the election system works. If you have any friends in Florida or Ohio, they'll hear a lot about it. What I would like to start off with is just to spend a few minutes trying to analyze the Jewish vote in recent elections. These are the past 4 years, and you can see clearly Republicans, Democrat, there is a clear trend here. Going back to 2000, that's up there, that's Bush versus Gore. 79% of Jewish Americans voted for Al Gore, 19% for George Bush. The reasons, Jewish Americans liked Al Gore. They knew him from the Clinton administration. They were suspicious about George W. Bush because of his father, and we'll talk about George H.W. Bush later on. Because of the choice of Dick Cheney as vice president, we see that's a pretty low number of 19%. 4 years later, we're after 9/11, we're in the midst of the Iraq and Afghanistan war. We see a little bump on the Republican side. George Bush is getting 25%, while John Kerry on the Democratic side got 74%. Again, it's a very slight change, but it is significant. The reasons we can guess: first of all, America is at war. Many voters tend to rally behind the leader at times of war. Also, George Bush managed to forge this very special relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon at the time, and that probably also played into this, into part of the Jewish vote. Although, as we'll see later on, just how important is the Israel issue for American Jewish voters? That's something that's a little bit in debate. But we saw a little bump here in 2004. 2008, Obama versus McCain, 78% of American Jews voted for Obama. Clearly part of the excitement that many Americans had surrounding President Obama, and we see this in 2008 as well. 2012, probably the most significant change in recent years. 30% of American Jews voted for Mitt Romney, 69% for Barack Obama. We're talking about 2012. We're after already 4 years of very tense relations between Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. That definitely plays out with voters. And of course, there is also a general a drop in support for Obama after 4 years of presidency, and that's reflected here as well. And these trends, I think we can see that there's nothing new about them. This is a Jewish vote going back to 1976, and basically you can see it's blue. Jews. So if you want it in a nutshell, you can see it right here, right now. Jewish Americans vote Democratic in an overwhelming way. But there are 2 points on this timeline that I would like to look at on this graph. One of them is 1980. Look what happened in 1980. 39% of Jews voted for Ronald Reagan and 45% for Jimmy Carter. That was the highest point for a Republican in many years and the lowest point for a Democrat in many years. The reasons? Jews didn't like Jimmy Carter. Okay, how do we define American Jews? That's a good question. Basically, we'll just base this on research that's done, which is based on exit polls. That's how we know most of this data on voting patterns. Ask people that when they're coming out of the polling station, who did you vote for? And then you ask them several demographic characteristics. And if they say they're Jewish Americans for this matter. Now you can go back to the Pew poll, to the Pew survey. It has a very detailed discussion of how you define Jewish Americans. But for our matter, these are self-defined Jewish Americans. So one point is 1980. That's a high point for Republicans, a low point for Democrats. The other interesting point is 2000. I'm sorry, is 1992. 1992, you see, George H.W. Bush got only 11% of the Jewish vote. Why was that? Because Jewish voters didn't like George Bush Sr., just because there are many young people in the room. Famously going back to his public rant against AIPAC after the battle with the Israeli government over loan guarantees, and the now famous saying of James Baker, who told George Bush before the elections, F the Jews, they never vote for us. And you know what? They didn't vote for him. That was part of the debate at the time. It was a very heated debate, and frankly, I'm not sure it's instructive for other things. Just the only thing it can teach us is that when the relationship between a president and the Jewish community is specifically bad, it will be reflected in the polls, and this goes back 100 years, and you can see all the trend lines here. At the best of days, the Republicans got 40% of the Jewish vote. That's Eisenhower there for those who can't see. So why do Jews vote Democratic? Many of them feel more comfortable with the values or the ideas that the Democratic Party represents, whether it has to do with social justice, New Deal, relations with minorities, church and state separation, and also because I think Jewish voters in general feel less concerned about the extreme margins of the Democratic Party than they are with the extreme margins of the Republican Party. In other words, each party has its crazies on each margin. Jewish voters are more worried about the Republican crazies because of issues that you can imagine. We have to acknowledge the fact that it is changing a little bit, and let's try to figure out why that's happening. Definitely Republicans are making small inroads into the Jewish voter pool, but the increase is so small, and also keep in mind we're talking about Jewish Americans are 2% of the American population, about 2.8% of the voter population, because Jews vote in higher percentage than most Americans. Still, we're talking about very, very small numbers. So if we see here a shift from 21 to 25% or something like that, these are very, very small numbers. Still, so you'll ask Republicans, what are we seeing here? And they say, oh, definitely we're seeing here a trend. There's an undeniable shift. American Jews, very slowly, but American Jews are warming up to the ideas of the Republican Party. Ask Democrats, they'll say, you know, with all the money that Jewish Republicans are putting into trying to convince Jewish voters to vote Republican, this is showing very, very small returns. And frankly, it seems that if you'd want to invest really in Jewish voters, it would seem much different. Now, have things changed? What has changed that made these slight changes possible? One of them is the fact that, at least in recent years, in the past 8 years, Israel has become a partisan issue. It was always a little bit of a partisan issue, but now it became more pronounced in that way. And that's something that a Republican and Republican Jews can definitely, they definitely feel that they can cash on that, that is something that in the long run can help convince Jewish voters. And again, Israel is not a defining issue for voters, but they do feel that it can convince Jewish voters down the road to support the Republicans, or at least give them another reason to support Republicans. The other issue has to do more with sociology and demography, and that's the fact that there is a generational shift, and that many would say that, and I don't think it was researched all that well, but it's this notion that's out there, that the younger generation of Jewish voters has a different set of priorities and values than the generation of their parents and grandparents. And you know, they used to say that Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. Now, some would say Jews are voting more based on their class and less based on their faith. Younger Jews, meaning like many other well-off Americans, Jewish voters are likely to support a party of lower taxes, smaller government, less public spending. Now, of course, all that is true until you go to a rally of Bernie Sanders and you see thousands of Jewish supporters there, and maybe it isn't true. So all these trends, you should just take them with a grain of salt, because there is no real way of analyzing what's going on there. But if we do accept the idea that there is this change that's going on, we should ask ourselves a bigger question. Will it carry over to 2016? What happens now? So everyone's laughing. This is Donald Trump. Quick question. Is Donald Trump the person who can win over Jewish voters? The answer is probably no. He's probably not. I wrote a story for the Forward a couple of weeks ago about Jewish supporters of Donald Trump, and I never encountered something like that before. It was very difficult to find Jewish voters who will say, I support Donald Trump. And Jews aren't usually shy about telling you what they think exactly about everyone. Jews, you know, another story that comes to mind, there was this rabbi in Edison, New Jersey, who started a Facebook group, and he called it Rabbis for Trump. But then after he started it, he had to change it to Rabbi for Trump, because he was the only member of this group. And just last week, he announced that he's closing the group because even he doesn't support Trump anymore. Jewish voters, that's a true story. Jewish voters in general are turned off by the message of Donald Trump. They find it offensive, extreme. The Islamophobic message, the xenophobic message, his ideas about immigration really don't resonate all that well with Jewish voters. Ted Cruz. Okay, we're hearing more reactions here. Now, Ted Cruz again represents a strain in the Republican Party that's not all that appealing to Jewish voters, but he does have some support. Interestingly, Ted Cruz did put in some time and effort in trying to reach out to Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish voters, and he seems to have some success, at least in terms of making ties and finding potential donors among these communities. Again, we're talking about the margins of the Jewish community there, but among Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox voters, there are some who find his attitude towards religion in public space, the role of religion in government, as appealing, and of course his openness to the idea of more talk about, in a sense, lowering the wall that separates between church and state. That does appeal to some Jewish voters, but definitely we're not talking about the masses here. Which leaves us with what we tend to call the mainstream Republicans, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, and Marco Rubio. Now, for the Republican establishment, these are the people, one of these guys, this is who they'd like to see as the next presidential candidate, mainly because when you're from the mainstream, you have a better chance of attracting undecided voters, whereas it's harder to do that when you're coming from the right or from the left. And that's true also with the Republican Jewish establishment, Republican Jewish coalition, major donors. they tend to support, even though the Republican Jewish Coalition, of course, doesn't endorse any of them, they tend to support more candidates like these that we see here that are basically the mainstream Republicans still left in the race. And the reason is that they have a conservative message that resonates better with the Jews. The idea of being fiscally conservative, the idea of talking about small government, of lowering spending, and at the same time talking less about the values issues or the family issues, about abortions, about women's rights, about LGBT rights. Although, of course, if you look historically, 20 years ago, we wouldn't call any of these moderates, but in the current field, they are considered moderate. This is probably where, these are the candidates probably that Jewish voters would be willing to vote for. But then you have to ask yourself, how attractive are they in bringing new voters? And I'm not sure right now we're seeing the excitement that behind any one of them that could actually give Republican or Jewish Republicans a hope that this is the one leader who can sweep over the Jewish voters. But one safe bet is that if Donald Trump or Ted Cruz get the nomination, it will be very difficult for Republicans to maintain their achievement from 2012 or to increase the numbers, because these are really messages that don't resonate well with Jewish voters. And just look at this picture. Okay, this is Sarah Palin. For those of you who are really young and don't remember anything. Now, what happened in 2008? In 2008, Barack Obama was an unknown quantity, and some people had questions about it. John McCain, definitely a legitimate candidate for Jewish voters, comes from the mainstream of the Republican Party, a strong security-minded figure. And then he chose Sarah Palin as his running mate. Now, that lost him votes in the general public because many people thought that was a lapse of judgment that indicates problems in the future. But also, and I don't think there's any polling about that, but something you definitely heard at the time from Jewish voters, it cost him Jewish voters who really felt uncomfortable with a candidate like Sarah Palin and with her, what they call the God talk, with too much talk about God in the context of politics. It made Jewish voters uncomfortable, and if the Republicans had any chance back then of winning Jewish voters, that cost him, the choice of Sarah Palin definitely made that impossible. And that is also the reason why if Ted Cruz is a candidate, we're probably not going to see a huge shift of Jewish voters towards the Republican side. So it's time to talk about the Democrats a bit. Well, President Obama probably had the worst time with the Jewish community than any president before him. And we mentioned George Bush Sr., who had a rough year with Jewish voters, and we saw how it turned out in the polls later on. For President Obama, it wasn't a rough year. It's a rough 8 years with the Jewish community, mainly surrounding the issue of Israel. And if you come to my 10 p.m. Talk, you'll hear more about that. But it was probably the worst that any president had, mainly because of his relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the debate over the Iran deal, and the perception that was created in part because of political reasons and in part for other reasons, the perception that he is not supportive of Israel as expected of an American president. And a couple of notes about that. First of all, it is important to note that at the same time, when we see President Obama under constant attack from pro-Israel circles in the United States, he didn't lose that much of the Jewish vote, which comes to show you, A, that the pro-democratic sentiment among Jewish Americans is stronger than and deeper than we probably think, and it doesn't fluctuate that much. And B, that there's this huge gap between what you hear from Jewish leaders and what you hear from and what Jewish rank and file members of the community are feeling. And of course that goes to the whole other discussion of who represents the Jewish community and who speaks to the Jewish community. But definitely when you look at the numbers that President Obama got in 2012, you understand that this wasn't the vote of the members of the Conference of Presidents and AIPAC and ADIA. This was the vote of the Jewish people, and it's very different, and that's, again, something for another discussion. But whatever the reason, Democrats understand now that they really have to correct course, and I think the candidate who understands it more than anyone else is Hillary Clinton. Ever since she started thinking, I don't know, she probably started thinking of presidency when she was 12, but ever since she started actively getting this campaign together, she made clear that there is a certain daylight between her positions and those of President Obama on some of the major issues relating to the Middle East. Mainly on the question of a military intervention in Syria, but also the Iran deal. She supported the Iran deal, but definitely voiced a more skeptical tone than President Obama, and also regarding her relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, she had a tough time with Bibi Netanyahu in her 4 years as Secretary of State, but still she managed to frame it in a way that is not seen as if she has this personal animosity towards Bibi Netanyahu, which is very different than the situation President Obama is in. So by distancing herself from the Obama policy ever so slightly, Hillary Clinton basically is in a position to tell Jewish voters, to send this message that you're all democratic like I am. We all support the same thing. And if you were worried in the past 8 years about this tension between Washington and Jerusalem, don't worry, it will be better when I'm president. And this is basically the message that she's sending, both in policy and also the advisors that surround her. She is consulting with people like Madeleine Albright or Leon Panetta or Tom Donnellan. These are people that have a very mainstream position regarding US-Israel relations. But she's not the only one in the race. What about Bernie? Well, there's a big question mark surrounding Bernie Sanders with anything that has to do with foreign policy. The guy doesn't like to talk about foreign policy. He likes to talk about his vote against the Iraq war. Not sure if you ever heard him say that, but he says it every time. But beyond that, he doesn't really spell out his foreign policy on any issue, and he really very rarely speaks about Israel. So is this an issue for Jewish voters? Not sure. It will take time to see, and we have to see, of course, what emerges from this campaign that Bernie Sanders is running, which is just like Donald Trump. It's so unpredictable and so unprecedented that we don't really have the tools to analyze where it's going and what's it going to be. Of course, the biggest paradox is that you have here the Jewish politician that has reached the highest position of any other Jewish candidate ever. He is the first Jew to win a state in the primaries. And still, he's not getting the excitement from the Jewish community that he's getting from the general public, which is interesting, and it probably has to do with the fact that Bernie Sanders is, in a sense, less Jewish than the others. Not less Jewish in his beliefs, of course, but less Jewish in the terms of visibly and in a pronounced way being a member of the, being an active Jew. Compare it to Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman was on a vice president ticket, and he ran for presidency, and he was the most Jewish thing out there, because the first thing that people knew about Joe Lieberman was that he was Jewish. On Shabbat, he walks from his home in Georgetown to Capitol Hill to vote if in the snow. We all heard that story. Not so for Bernie Sanders. He feels uncomfortable discussing his faith, his Jewish beliefs, if we can extract it from his statements and comments on that, is based more on the concept of tikkun olam than on ritual, and he said that he's not a part of any kind of organized religious following. So definitely for Jewish voters, he poses a question. I mean, you can like him, you cannot like him, but the questions that are of concern to Jews are less relevant when it comes to Bernie Sanders. So One more thing I want to talk about, and mention it a little bit, is what do Jewish voters care about? Jewish American voters love Israel, care about Israel, but they view Israel as a threshold issue, not as a deciding factor. Meaning, any presidential candidate from the gallery of people that we saw here a minute ago needs to pass a certain threshold when it comes to Israel. Needs to be supportive of Israel, needs to support foreign aid to Israel, needs to be part of, needs to have the commitment to the safety and security of the state of Israel. And once you make sure that that's happening, then it becomes a non-issue. That's probably the reason that Republicans, even though they feel to a certain extent that they have something working for them now, that the idea that being pro-Israel has become, in the past 8 years, a partisan issue, that Republicans have somehow branded themselves as the pro-Israel party, as opposed to Democrats who are more reluctant to support Israel, or have more questions, or have different views, or there's some daylight between them and Israel. This notion will just take you so far in terms of politics, because voters don't really view it that way. Voters want to know that their president is okay on Israel. And once they check that box, they move on. And frankly, the threshold of being pro-Israel is pretty low. You have to be good enough not to have an advisor like Jim Baker tell you what he said about the Jews. And you have to be supportive of foreign aid, which all candidates are. Even Rand Paul, who was in the race, kind of came around to support foreign aid to Israel. And you have to support the idea that you're protecting a democratic stronghold in the Middle East. And frankly, all candidates from both sides feel the same on that. So once you establish that, there really isn't a question. The Israel question becomes less significant in our discussion. Why do we care about the Jewish vote? Well, first of all, we care about it because we're Jewish voters and we want to know how Jewish Americans are voting. The parties care about it because even though the numbers are very small, and we saw the breakdown, we're talking about small percentage of a small percentage of voters, and it doesn't move much. Parties care about that, first of all, because while in New York and California it won't matter much, it will make a difference, or it can make a difference in Florida and in Ohio, the key swing states that candidates are looking for. There is some research that was done in 2012 that kind of questioned the notion that the Jewish vote was that important in Florida, but still, it's not something any party would want to take a chance on. So that's why it's important for them. It's also important because Jewish Americans are disproportionately involved in American politics. They vote more than others, and more significantly, they give more money to politics than others. We just ran a story in the Forward yesterday about how a major super PAC that supports Hillary Clinton is basically funded primarily by Jewish American voters and donors. We know about key Jewish donors on the Republican side, whether it's Sheldon Adelson or Paul Singer or others, that give such huge amounts of money that they could be game changers. And we saw, of course, the example of Sheldon Adelson's support for Newt Gingrich, who kept a candidate viable for months, even though he never had the support. So definitely the issue of Jewish money in politics is also significant, and that's what candidates are looking for. And also one more thing that we should keep in mind when we discuss especially the issue of Israel, is that when Republicans talk about Israel, they don't care only about the Jewish voters, that small number of 6.5 million Jewish Americans. They also care about evangelical Christian voters. And for evangelical Christian voters, maybe for a large majority of those 50 million voters, Israel is an issue, and they're looking for a candidate who'll be strong on Israel, supportive of Israel, and probably supportive of the more right-wing approach to Israel. So all these issues make the question of the Jewish vote and how the candidates see it more significant. So I'd like to open it up to discussion now, and just, the only prediction I'm willing to make about the presidency is that come November 8th, after we hear the results, both sides will say that they won. The Republicans are going to tell you, we won the Jewish vote. Democrats are going to tell you that. It happens every 4 years. But we'll have to look at that. But I think now it would be interesting to hear your thoughts and maybe questions about this. Why don't we start over here? Okay, I'll repeat the question for the camera. It was about Michael Bloomberg. If he'll join the race, then what does that mean? First of all, if Bloomberg basically said that he'll step in if the situation emerges in which Donald Trump is a candidate on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders is the candidate on the Democratic side. And in that case, Bloomberg feels that mainstream America won't have its voice in these elections, and that's where he feels that he can come in as a third-party candidate. What does that mean? First of all, it means that if under this scenario that you'll have out of 3 candidates, 2 of them are going to be Jewish, which is really unprecedented. Not to mention Donald Trump's Jewish son-in-law and Jewish granddaughter. But yeah, and his daughter who converted, of course. But what does it mean? Now, of course, history teaches us that American voters aren't too kind towards third-party candidates. They're more a spoiler than an actual possibility to make a change. Michael Bloomberg could be different under this what seems now at least to be an extreme scenario in which Sanders wins the Democratic nomination and Trump wins the Republican nomination. But it is interesting because, of course, Bloomberg, like Trump, is a billionaire. He's somewhat also of a bigger-than-life character. He's been a Republican, he's been a Democrat, he's been an independent. So he doesn't come with too much of an ideological ideological baggage to him. So in that sense, he can be attractive to many voters, maybe even to Jewish voters. But again, just keep in mind that it would be difficult for a third-party candidate. It would have to be a very extreme situation in which a majority of Americans really back a third-party candidate because it's so unusual. But we're in an unusual election cycle. How will it play out with the Jewish vote? I think there are many Jewish voters, especially in New York, who are sympathetic to Michael Bloomberg. They liked him as mayor. They like what he represents. They like his mainstream message. But again, Jews are so entrenched within the Democratic Party that when it comes to a vote between Michael Bloomberg and a Democratic candidate, I think most Jews will find it difficult to vote for Bloomberg. So the question was, how do we disconnect? If Israel has become a partisan issue, how do we untangle that? How do we disconnect the partisan politics from the issue of Israel? Well, first of all, it's not going to happen. It's a very good question because it's not going to happen easily because Republicans feel that they have something to gain here. That by branding themselves as the pro-Israel party, they have some political gain there. So it's not going to be easy. But we should keep in mind that even under this partisan situation, there's pretty much a broad understanding on both sides of the basic tenets of what it means to be supportive of Israel. Again, foreign aid passes with a huge majority in Congress every year, and it's something worthwhile looking at. You know, it's not easy to pass a $3 billion spending item in Congress, and instead it passes every time. The idea of military support for Israel also exists on both sides, and the challenge will be how to disconnect it, by making clear to both sides that there's not much to gain by turning this into a partisan issue. And frankly, there's something to be done also on the side of Israel and pro-Israel activists in the United States who should be careful not to fall into this trap of making Israel into a partisan issue. They weren't so good at doing it in the past 4 years, and maybe it will happen in the future. What do non-Jewish Democratic voters think? That's an interesting question. Most non-Jewish Democratic voters don't really care about this as an issue. It's not a key issue for them. Interestingly, when you look at polls that analyze Democratic voters, there is a disconnect between Democratic elected officials who are very supportive of Israel and progressive grassroots who are much less connected or supportive of the idea of Israel. Okay, thanks. I'll repeat the questions. One of them was about voting rates of Jewish Americans. I don't know the exact numbers, but they're significantly higher than the general public. So we tend to say that even though Jews are something like 2.1% or up to 2.2% of American population, they make up somewhere between 2.5% to 3% of the voters, which means that Jews vote more. The second question was about the donors and their priorities. Now, first of all, when you look at Jewish donors, a lot of them have the same set of priorities that others do, especially on the Democratic side. They care about many things that have nothing to do specifically with Jewish values or with Israel. On the Republican side, of course, we're looking mainly at one major donor, Sheldon Adelson, who sees himself as a single-issue pro-Israel donor, and who has yet to endorse any candidate or support any candidate on the Republican side. And definitely, their point of view is that they support more of a hawkish view towards Israel. Now, does that reflect the broader Jewish community? Probably not. It probably reflects a smaller portion of the Jewish community, but it is something that, of course, because of the way the political system is, candidates listen more to the donors than to the voters, so definitely that could explain to a certain extent the more hawkish positions that we see among Republican candidates towards Israel. Why don't we go over there, sir? Yeah. Between denominations within the Jewish community. In general, and I don't think that's very surprising, Orthodox Jews are the only stronghold of the Republican Party has within the Jewish community. Orthodox Jews tend to vote more to Republican candidates than conservative and reform. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, which you didn't mention earlier, that Republicans seem to be kind of optimistic about the Jewish vote, because when you look at Jewish demography, Orthodox Jews are increasing in their share of the Jewish community, while other denominations are declining. Well, of course, the question was about AIPAC, the pro-Israel, the largest pro-Israel lobbying group. Yes, definitely, AIPAC has a very effective system in place, and they work with elected officials from the point in which they go into politics, whether it's on the state level, sometimes even on college campuses. So they work to educate voters to be more pro-Israel, to educate elected officials to be more pro-Israel. And it's very effective, and that's why that's one of the reasons, at least, that we see in Congress such broad support for Israel, whereas it doesn't always translate, at least on the Democratic side, to the grassroots. Now, it's important to note when we talk about AIPAC, because there's, of course, a big debate going on, and we saw that during the discussion about the Iran nuclear deal. There was a sense that AIPAC may be showing its partisan colors in a way. And that's something that the lobby really makes a huge effort to avoid, because AIPAC does understand, despite the fact that they're probably more hawkish than the rest of than the Jewish community, and more towards more supportive of the side of Bibi than others among American Jewish voters. It is important to understand that basically the power of AIPAC stems from the fact that Israel is a bipartisan issue. And there's no one out there that's more concerned about making Israel a partisan issue than AIPAC, because they are actually the people out there on Capitol Hill every day trying to convince members of Congress to support legislation that Israel cares about. And they know very well that today you have a Democrat in the White House, tomorrow you might have a Republican, then the next day you'll have a Democrat. That majority shifts in both chambers of Congress. So they understand the need to really keep Israel a bipartisan issue. I'm not sure they were that successful in doing that during the Iran debate, but they understand that's a big issue. Yes, please. Thanks a lot. So basically, we have an Iowa voter, and the point was that many of the Republicans, while campaigning in Iowa, basically got their information and education about Israel from Orthodox Jews in New York. And I think that is definitely something that's going on, both because of this interest in getting Jewish donors, mainly Jewish Orthodox donors, to support Republican candidate, and we saw Ted Cruz doing a lot of work at that. And that's probably the reason you see that. And again, as you mentioned, these are probably not the states in which the Jewish vote matters that much, but it was important for them to make that message heard. I covered the caucuses in Iowa. I noticed that too. It seemed that for a state that doesn't have that many Jews, they really care about Israel. Yes, ma'am. Okay, the question was about the role that the Israeli government and Netanyahu are playing in American politics since Netanyahu's visit to Congress in March of last year. Well, of course, officially, Israel is not involved in U.S. politics. We did see, I think it's undeniable that in 2012 at least, the atmosphere and the winds coming out of Jerusalem were more supportive of Mitt Romney than they were of President Obama. He was welcomed by Netanyahu to Israel. And of course, later on, you mentioned the famous speech to the address to the two chambers of Congress. Definitely there we saw an Israeli president, Israeli prime minister, taking a controversial move which was seen as being supportive of the Republicans more than of the Democrats. Now, was this the purpose of Netanyahu? I don't know. What's going on from here forward? Frankly, we haven't seen a lot of involvement of Israelis in general or the Israeli government in this debate that's going on right now. Maybe it's too early on. I would just mention that one of the largest supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is Sheldon Adelson, who is also a major player in Republican politics, and maybe we'll have a better picture once Adelson decides who he's going to back. Also worth noting that Donald Trump, for some reason, after making his comments about barring Muslims from entering the United States, said that he's going to come to visit Israel. And even though Netanyahu distanced himself from these comments, he said that he would welcome Trump like any other candidate in Israel. Eventually, Trump gave up that idea, so it never happened. Let's try over here, sir. Well, I know about the people you're seeing. I did notice it in Iowa or in New Hampshire, but basically these are places without many Jewish voters. I did hear, especially attending Donald Trump rallies, I did hear some very, very harsh things from people attending and from people standing in line. They did come from a position that was somewhat conspiratorial regarding President Obama. But these comments that you refer to are basically something that we've seen in the past 8 years that go beyond the issue of making Israel into a partisan issue. There was also, and a lot of this was going on in email exchanges and in email groups, which spread all these rumors about whether Obama's a Muslim. I get all this stuff because people forward it to me. Muslims in the White House, all these really unbased claims that are spreading out there to thousands of people. Many of them are Jewish. And I think this is unique to the past few years, and I don't know if it's something that will disappear now, but definitely you're onto something here that is going on. Okay, so sure. So the question was about how the changes in media are impacting Jewish voters, and well, you can take it in all different directions. On the one hand, as you notice, the news media has become more partisan. You can either get your news from Fox News or from MSNBC, and you'll feel that you're living in parallel universes because it's a whole different set of news on either side. And that's Jews, I think, traditionally are known to be very educated and aware and interested in news. And I don't think this partisan divide really serves anyone, especially not the Jewish voters. And yes, I have noticed anecdotally more Jews, especially more hawkish Jews, getting their news from Fox. So that does mean something. On the other hand, this whole traditional media, unfortunately, I should say, as someone who works at it, is going away. And when you go to a Bernie Sanders event, you understand that these 10,000 people that are there, they never turned on Fox News or MSNBC, and they never opened the New York Times. So there's nothing to worry about that. They're getting their information from somewhere else totally. And when you get most of your news from social media, that is a whole new ball game, which surprisingly, the person who knows how to use this better than anyone else is a 74-year-old Jew from Brooklyn. So go figure, exactly. Yes, please. I think that's a great testament to the wonderful times we're living in. The fact that no one thinks it's a big deal that Bernie Sanders is Jewish or that Michael Bloomberg is Jewish. No one cares about it. It's never an issue. I think that is really, if you need a sign that you're living in a very comfortable and good time for Jews in America, that is it. Jewish major donors, especially on the Republican side, who tend to be single issue donors. We mentioned Sheldon Adelson, who kind of defines himself as a single issue donor on Israel. By the way, we should mention on the Democratic side at least one, Chaim Saban, who is a single issue donor on Israel issues and is very close to the Clintons. The idea, the way it works basically with donors and mega donors is that they look at this gallery of candidates that's out there, and they want to see who's best to advance the causes that I believe in, and therefore I will support this candidate. There's, of course, I'm sure you heard of this, what we call now the Adelson primaries that take place in Vegas. All the candidates come to his hotel, to the Venetian in Vegas, and try to convince Sheldon Adelson that they're strong on Israel. It's worthwhile doing so. This is someone who put in $100 million in the 2012 elections. So basically what donors do is they look for people that are supportive of their interests. Having said that, no one is really a single issue donor. I mean, Adelson cares about Israel. He also cares about online gambling. That's a big issue for him. Unions are a big issue for him. Paul Singer cares about Israel. He also cares about LGBT rights. Chaim Saban has his business interests. So definitely there's no one single issue, but there are those who stress it more than others. And they want to find a candidate that they know that if he or she become president, they can trust them to advance the causes that they care about. Yes, please. Thanks. The question was, is the Jewish vote a bellwether to other constituencies? Frankly, I don't think so. I think the interesting part is that Jewish voters stand out as being unusual. I don't have the data here, but I think in 2008 and 2012, Jewish voters were the most supportive group for President Obama after African Americans. I think they stand out as being extremely democratic, and these small shifts that we've seen, because they're so small, I don't think they're indicative of anything else. We can probably put together a graph that will look at the general vote and the Jewish vote. I'm not sure they follow. I think the Jewish vote is unique in that sense. But again, the numbers are so small that statistically it would be hard to even learn anything from such a small group. Okay, I think, is there anyone else there? Great. Well, thanks so much for coming. Happy to talk later on. Thanks.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to JEM, To Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.